Warning, this video contains spoilers for Thor Love and Thunder. Please proceed at your own risk. If you want my general consensus on the film spoiler free, jump to this timestamp in the video. With that out of the way, I hope you enjoy. I don't think I've expressed it enough on this channel, but I'm a massive Thor fan. When the MCU really started to come to the spotlight, the idea of all hero constantly having to be worthy of the power they wield just captivated me. I remember as a kid constantly rewatching the first Thor films as it just seemed to have that magic that other films couldn't give me for some reason. Along the way, I really started to become more of a nerd and went further than the films to get into the actual comics of Thor. And I thought they were awesome, it just made me love the character more. But one story from those comics stood out to me, and that was The Mighty Thor by Jason Aaron. The run of Jane being worthy of Mjolnir. There was just that wonder to it that I couldn't explain. The whole concept of what if heroism was killing you just hooked me, I couldn't let go. It was a story of selflessness, self-worth, and acceptance. It was just everything that I wanted from a tale relating to Thor. And yeah, I'm one of those people that may argue that Jane is more worthy of Mjolnir than Thor is, but hey, this is my take and a discussion for another time. So I'm pretty sure you can now tell that I was more than just excited to find out that this incredible story would be the inspiration for a film.
Storyline, it's incredible, it's full of emotion and love and thunder, and it introduces, for the first time, female Thor. So, for us, there's only one person who could play that role. Only one. And she's here. I'm going to introduce her to you now. Please, welcome to the stage, Natalie Portman.
I've been super hyped for Love and Thunder the moment it got announced at Comic-Con all those years ago. We got Taiki Waiti returning to direct, the entire cast from the last film reprising their roles, and Natalie freaking Portman returning to play not only Jane Foster, but Jane Foster's Thor. So it doesn't come too much of a shocker that my heart broke, fell, and shattered at the news that certain circumstances would have it be delayed. So I calmly waited patiently for news of when the film would finally resurface, and when they did, my hype only got bigger, cause we got Christian Bale as Gorr the freaking God Butcher. One of my all-time favorite villains from the comics. With all the news that we've been getting, everything just really seems to be gearing up for this next installment of Thor's repertoire to be big. But I am still kinda nervous with how early impressions of the film as it was being released say that it was kinda bad. But I never really take those words as fact until I've seen the actual work for myself. So, after seeing the film at last, what do I have to say about it? Yeah, a lot of those criticisms are kinda justified, so I should address this now before we dive into my thoughts too much, but I know a majority of the harsh feelings I have towards the film is definitely due to me having such high expectations before going to see it. That's my fault, so you can hate me for that, I won't blame you. But it also just feels a bit strange with how mixed I am about this film. On one hand, a part of me really liked what they did with it, but on the other, a lot of decisions I see throughout it all are kinda questionable. Oh, and I should also say, I'm not going to go too much into the fields of the comedy versus cinema argument that's around the film's reputation, but I'll say this. Yes, this is a comedy. It doesn't take itself seriously so much, and some of the jokes do land. Like, oh my gosh, Stella Stormbreaker, most memorable joke of the whole film. I was bawling every time it happened. But then there's also some jokes that didn't really seem to work. Like Jane's takes on her own heroic catchphrases like, let's bring the rainbow or eat my hammer. Like, yeah, I get it. It's fitting for her character and arc for the film, but still kind of felt a bit out of place for some reason. I don't know, maybe it's just me, I know other people love it. Then there's stuff like the screaming goats. They were funny at first, but it did get pretty old after a while. I do appreciate that we get these jokes and made the film a fun watch, but as I said in some of my previous videos, comedy can be really subjective, so everybody has their taste, and sometimes it works, and sometimes it just doesn't. Oh, another thing, I'm also not going to go over too much about how the CGI looks, since, well, I'm more of a writer and editor. CGI is really not my field of expertise. Except that freaking flowing head effect, I think almost anyone could tell that was kinda bad. Hashtag no different visual effects! I'm just gonna majorly cover things like the writing and plot, the expression of the characters, and how they adapted certain things from the comics into the MCU, which to me were the biggest things I was looking at when first seeing the film. And I could probably say that I couldn't be more disappointed with some of these elements that were used. Let's start with the elephant in the room, the big selling point for the movie, and the one thing that the moment I heard was going to be a part of the film instantly made me pre-order my ticket. Jane Foster as the Mighty Thor. Don't take this the wrong way. I love Jane. I love what they did with Jane as Thor. I love how Natalie Portman expressed the character. You could tell she was really happy to be back to play Jane and to do it with the hammer in her hand. I was also really glad that they actually incorporated her cancer plotline into the film. One of the most tragic and emotionally investing stories I personally read from the comics. Also, I know there's a lot of mixed feelings about it, but I'm among the few that actually kinda like the post-credits scene of Jane in Valhalla. However, I can understand why people don't like it. It does take away the emotional weight of Jane's and Thor's last moments together before she succumbs to her cancer. But I guess I enjoyed it since 1, it actually gives her a chance to be the character she deserves to be in the future of the MCU, and 2, someone pointed out on Twitter that this scene has a thematic meaning since it's set in an actual Norse myth and in the film that you can only get to Valhalla by dying in battle, which you may think that Jane didn't since she died of illness. But as this user pointed out, she was able to go to Valhalla because she was going through her battle with cancer, which to me is a cool way to express such a message. It's really sweet. But how they played that cancer story throughout the film itself felt really fast and not entirely what it could have been. Indeed, they did make it sad that Jane had to go through such a rough illness, but one of the major flaws to how they handled it is that they didn't really emphasize the hard balance between her sickness and wielding Mjolnir, the heart of what made her story in the comics so great and tragic. I guess they necessarily didn't need to have that balance since, as we'll talk about later, she doesn't really have the whole split life thing going on like in the original story. They did go into that form of balance a little bit with the scene in the bathroom that shows the hammer really is making her condition worse, and the moment of her struggling to crawl to the hammer while Thor had to watch, like, wow, that actually felt hard to watch. But it kinda just feels weird since the way they set it up early on into the film didn't make me care too much about the fact that she's sacrificing her life to play the hero, since there's not really a life she has in the film outside of her being Thor. Sure, Jane did end up being the Mighty Thor by wielding Mjolnir, and with it carrying the weight of the responsibility that came with it, while making the decision to be its wielder despite finding out that it's killing her. But the thing is, as said before, they don't really give her a personality or give her something other than her cancer to be a part of her life. In the comics, she was more than just a cancer victim. Even outside of being a Thor, she still wanted to do good for the ones around her as a mortal woman. Her entire life and good nature didn't completely revolve around or was limited by that hammer. She made the choice that despite knowing that the hammer would slowly kill her, she still chose to pick it up to be Thor. But more importantly, she continues to make the choice of letting it go, giving up a part of her mortal life with it. Jane Foster and the Mighty Thor on their own could be seen as two characters, two different identities, but it's Jane's worthiness and Mjolnir that ties them together, what amplified her initial kind nature to do good as the goddess of thunder. And the film, that connection just wasn't there. Jane's comic counterpart states that she chooses to make that choice to give her a sense of what she was fighting for, to understand the pain that other mortals experience so she could do her best to try and prevent them from feeling that pain. There was a reason for her cancer to be a part of her story as Thor. What she's going through as Jane Foster is what gives her the push to be the Mighty Thor, and the fact that she makes that choice to sacrifice a part of herself every time she wields Mjolnir is what makes her so noble and interesting as a hero. But that aspect of choice is almost completely removed from the film, at least to a degree. She still makes the choice to help Thor fight Gorr and save the Asgardian children, along with the scenes I mentioned before to show the hammer's effect on her. But let me ask this. What did Jane have to lose before being Thor? I mean, I guess she did have Darcy and Selvig that cared about her, but they were only in the film for like the first 5 minutes and don't ever come back, so why should I and the audience care? They did later on show her having a life outside of them with Thor and their relationship, but all that felt so little since it was played off as a joke since it was part of a rom-com bit, which was cute and fitting for both of their characters and the sense of humor that the film had, but still didn't establish enough of her character prior to being Thor that it just didn't make me feel too attached to what she had beforehand, and what she could possibly be giving up to be Mjolnir's new wielder. However, one of the biggest surprises I had when I watched the movie for the first time was that they almost immediately showed to Thor that Jane was worthy, which honestly is a very interesting take to make the story slightly different from the comics. In the comics, Thor knew about Jane's cancer, but not her worthiness. In the film, it's the opposite. Thor knew about Jane's worthiness, but not her cancer. It was a change that I was excited to see play out as the film went on, but then they kinda just did nothing with it. It felt like they had 1 or 2 scenes of there actually being some weight of her hiding it from Thor, but then the secret is just out and they have to deal with it. All that potential emotional way from wanting to keep it hidden from Thor to not worry him was just instantly gone, because Thor just awkwardly pushed it out of Jane. The most prominent issue I have with Jane specifically, however, was how the film expressed her worthiness and how she exactly became the Mighty Thor. One of the last things Korg tells the audience when finishing the story that he started to tell at the beginning of the film says that Jane showed us all what it truly meant to be worthy, which to me is kinda true, but not true at the same time. Yes, she did show one aspect of worthiness by wielding Mjolnir, despite knowing that while she held it, it would make her cancer worse, slowly killing her, and also putting her desire to help the Asgardian people over helping herself first. Those indeed are Thor-like qualities that could deem her worthy of the hammer's power. But the biggest problem that I have around her worthiness in the film is that prior to her being able to wield Mjolnir, there's really no justification as to why she could be worthy. Now, to be fair, Jane didn't have an entire separate film to set up that origin of worthiness like Thor did, so it's not like we could take super long on that topic. But I still think it could have been done with what little runtime this film had, surprisingly. Like, seriously, why does this film have to be under 2 hours? It felt like half a film since all they do is jump from major plot point to major plot point to major plot point without any space in between to flesh it all out. Sorry, I got a bit off track. Let's get back to Jane. The only thing that Jane does before actually becoming Thor is try and find a cure for her cancer, which could be unintentionally noble since it could help other people to overcome the illness, but the film never explicitly mentions that that's the intent she had behind doing it. It also doesn't help that it seems like she first saw out the hammer because she thought it could help her deal with or even heal her cancer. Throughout the later course of the film, Jane knew that the hammer was the problem, but when she first found it, she looked at it as the cure. That's like saying Tony could wield it just because he thought it'd be cool to rule Asgard with it, which just isn't what Mjolnir is about. When it comes to some cases as to how individuals obtain their strength or power in the MCU, there's two different ways they can go about doing so, and each have their different outcomes. The first being that someone comes across it unbeknownst to them at first, but learns of what it is and how much it actually means to have it, which majorly leads to someone like that to play the hero. The second way being how someone does everything they possibly can for it, and that usually leads them to play the villain. This should and needs to also apply to Jane with how she wields Mjolnir. One quote that follows part of this philosophy of power is, to me, one of the most memorable lines for Arcane spoken by its main antagonist, Silco. Silco is, as we see throughout the show, really only just a man, and yet he is feared but respected by almost everyone around him, and explains how he's garnered such a reputation with these words, quote,
"Power. Real power doesn't come to those who are born strongest, or fastest, or smartest. No, it comes to those who will do anything to achieve it."
As with that ideology that we see the evil deeds he does following that philosophy. In contrast, one of the things I like to put alongside the concept of Thor as a character, or at least specifically around when it comes to wielding Mjolnir, is true power for good comes to those that believe they don't deserve it. By taking that sort of idea away from Jane's character in Love and Thunder, you take away the aspect that she really deserves Mjolnir and its power. Throughout the film, she's not nervous or speculative towards herself if she truly deserves the hammer or not. She instantly becomes the Mighty Thor, is just majorly overconfident and has almost no struggles when it comes to wielding it and being the hero that people look up to, which just makes her arc a bit unsatisfying. Sure, she does make up for not having that aspect slightly by looking to and asking Thor what it means to him to be a hero, and choosing to help others over caring for herself later in the film when she finally reveals to Thor her sickness, but is still determined to help fight Gorr, which I seriously can't help but saying that scene felt kinda rushed and forced. You have this big heart-to-heart scene with these characters going over what is essentially the biggest thing to come between them, that one of them was dying. There really was emotion going on in scenes like this, but how we got to them just didn't make it feel that emotional. This is also where we get one of the biggest missed potential lines of the film. Jane tells Thor that she's still determined to help despite the cancer coming between them, and Thor comforts her by saying,
"Spoken like a true Thor."
That is a cute moment between these characters, but outside these few lines we've heard her say, Jane just doesn't feel like a true Thor. The way they just built it up and had it play out for the film made it feel like Jane wielding Mjolnir, becoming the Mighty Thor, didn't feel earned. Since stated earlier, there's no justification or reason for why she could be worthy before actually having the hammer in her hand, and also that it didn't feel satisfying for her to do these actions under the title, since they first show her as just a helpless character who finds Mjolnir and plays the hero now just cause she has to, all not showing any signs of being pressured or uneased about attaining this gift. It's been established in the MCU through the people and the interactions of the world that holding that hammer means something through the few people we've seen have the honor of being able to wield it. But I guess all those standards of awareness are just chucked out the window since we later learn in the film that Jane was actually able to wield the hammer because Thor unintentionally made her worthy by altering the enchantment on Mjolnir, which is kinda confusing. I mean, I guess it could make sense. Thor technically is the new Allfather now, so he could have the power to change the enchantment like how Odin put it there in the first place, but even that of itself is really strange. Hey, hi. Editor Rexformer here, and I realized something while in the post-production of this video. Thor had changed the enchantment while he was in his relationship with Jane, meaning it happened before their breakup in Ragnarok, meaning that it happened before Odin died. meaning that Thor didn't have the title of the Allfather yet, which just makes it all the more confusing as to how Thor could change the enchantment. I get the message of, oh, he loved her and the hammer was simply following that intent of love, but I still just find it hard to make all of this make sense. So just pretend I didn't know that prior to making this statement while first writing the script, but I just wanted to say I didn't realize it then, but I do now. Okay, that's all. Back to the video. Why would you change something that was cemented as a sign of true nobleness so that almost anyone could wield a hammer instead of having to earn that right? However, I will say it's a nice gesture to show how much Thor initially loved and cared about Jane before they went their separate ways. But it all feels really disheartening towards what the hammer stood for, since the action of Thor altering the enchantment takes away what made someone holding Mjolnir so special. Because of how the enchantment's been changed, Mjolnir doesn't choose Jane because of her spirit and heart and will of sacrifice like in the comics, or like Thor's redemption in the first film. It just chooses her since Thor told it to take care of her, which again is a sweet gesture between the characters and to fit the theme of the film, but takes away what could have made Jane being the Mighty Thor more special. To me, having Jane eventually earn Mjolnir, or at least show some form of selfless action while going through her trial of cancer prior to her being Thor, instead of just being able to wield it because she's close to Thor, could have led to a more investing reason for her to be a hero and have an interesting drive to face our antagonist alongside Thor. Which leads to my thoughts on Christian Bale's Gorr, which aside from Jane was probably the biggest letdown for the film to me. I'm not throwing shade at Bale's performance as a character. He did a great job playing the main antagonist of the film. It's just that when it came to how he expressed Gorr and adapting him from the comics, it wasn't exactly what I was expecting. I heard somewhere that Bale while in this role had a lot of inspiration from Heath Ledger's Joker from The Dark Knight, and yeah, after seeing his performance, I could definitely see that inspiration in action, specifically with his character's behavior and how he speaks and uses specific mannerisms in certain scenes. The only thing that kinda rubs me the wrong way is that it's not really what I had in mind when it came to adapting the character to the big screen, since in the comics, Gorr was more of an anti-messiah type figure rather than an unhinged maniac. I don't want to say that it felt a bit too Joker-like, but there were times while watching that I was thinking, this wasn't Gorr, or at least the one I knew. However, the major thing I found that quote-unquote butchered the potential of his character, get it? Butchered? Cause he's the god butcher.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
Anyway, what I found that kinda butchered his character for the film was how they changed the motives of his bloodlust as the titled God Butcher. In the first moments of the film, we're introduced to Gorr suffering on his home planet, while trying to help and care for his daughter, and constantly prays to their gods for food and water. Those prayers would go unanswered, however, as Gorr had to watch his daughter die in his arms from thirst and starvation. After having to bury her, he then immediately finds the god he worships and sees how selfish the deity truly is. Gorr is shocked to see just how little the god cares for Gorr despite how much praise and hope he saw in this figure. But because of this new intent and revenge towards his god, he's cursed by the Necrosword and becomes its new wielder. With the Necrosword now in his hands, corrupting him to do its bidding, he makes a vow that
all gods will die,
and takes the god's life, the first of many more to come. Even though this is literally the only time in the film we see him actually kill. That's what gives him his drive to kill the gods, which I could say is pretty similar to how he became the God Butcher in the comics. But I just feel like this setup didn't have everything it needed to have Gorr be an interesting antagonist. What made Gorr such an interesting villain to the world of Thor is that you could see that he is kinda right with his allegation towards the gods. Even Thor himself came to believe that Gorr had a right to pursue this dream of a godless universe. But in the opening scenes of how it sets up Gorr as the big bad of the film, just takes away that interesting background. It's just a simple revenge and cursed item story, instead of something that was philosophically interesting. Gorr was an interesting villain in the comics because it wasn't that he specifically hated the gods themselves. He hated the principle of the gods. He actually believed that he was doing all his fellow mortals a service by bringing an end to the gods throughout all space and time, so they wouldn't have to experience pain or abandonment through his perspective of how gods treat the mortals that praise them. And Gorr in Love and Thunder just didn't have that interesting aspect to him. A lot of people I hear say that Gorr has become the best villain in the MCU, and I kinda have to disagree with that statement, but he could have been. I mean, yeah, I see why people will say Gorr is incredible. Taika did say that he was going to make Gorr a sympathetic villain. Mission accomplished. I felt bad seeing him have to watch his daughter die, and Bale did a great job in expressing his sadness of that sight as Gorr talks about it throughout the film. But that to me isn't what made Gorr a sympathetic yet scary antagonist originally. What made Gorr a relatable villain in his original rendition was how some of us can relate to his feeling of abandonment. Gorr put everything he had towards the gods, but it brought him nothing. He lived his whole life in service to his gods, but he still had to suffer. He lost his wife, his child, his home, everything, which brought him to the point that he believed gods don't even exist, that he was alone, that all that time he did in the ways of the gods was wasted, only to learn towards what he thought would be the end of his life that they were really there, and all they did was watch and do nothing. And Love and Thunder's take on the character just didn't seem to have that kind of relatability. I know this is kind of just a rant at how Love and Thunder changed Gorr's character differently from how it was in the comics, but I'm not saying that that's a bad thing. I mean, for crying out loud, Gorr's appearance in the film isn't 100% accurate to his appearance in the comics, but it still works. Almost nothing in the MCU is entirely accurate to the comics, but that doesn't mean that certain aspects of it can't at least have some elements from the comics that made his character's world so iconic. I will say, Gorr's most slightly follow a unique aspect of him wanting to rid the gods of the universe, and did serve as an okay antagonist for the purposes of the story. But other than that, Gorr just didn't stick out as much as I think he needed to as a menacing villain. I also found it strange that the characters seem to talk about Gorr and the Necrosword as if they're a thing that exists, but they just don't care about, which to me really takes away what made Gorr a frightening presence. Gorr is more like a myth or ghost story type figure, something that's scary yet funny to think is real until you actually find out it is real and see that it's truly terrifying. But nope, he's kind of just been there the whole time and no one seems to care. The rest of the characters in the film were just fine to me. Thor is Thor, Valkyrie is Valkyrie, Korg is Korg. They have their problems, but I don't think they're worth mentioning like the ones I have with Jane and Gorr. But even outside the characters, there were just a lot of things that were strange for the plot. Like, why did Gorr take the Asgardians' kids specifically? He does state later that he uses them as bait to have Thor bring him Stormbreaker, but there are many other suitable and meaningful candidates for such a role. Like, I don't know, maybe Sif. The plot kinda didn't take advantage of her finally coming back, so having her be in the clutches of Gorr would at least give her some purpose for the story. Or what about the Guardians? Thor seemed to care about them barely when the film started, but like Sif, kinda just pieced out and got forgotten from the script altogether. If we had them be the ones to be captured instead, we, the audience, would be more invested in these characters being under threat, helping us to be engrossed in the direness and urgency of what the characters are going through, instead of trying to make us care for these kids that we just met. But either way, we got the kids, and yeah, they're kind of just there, and apparently Heimdall has a son, which I don't know about you, but I remember him ever bringing that up in the previous films. I guess he's just being introduced here so he can serve a purpose for the bigger picture of the MCU, but it still just feels bizarre. Even with this new addition, he doesn't really have anything to offer for the grand scheme of the story. He's just a plot device so Thor could have a means to talk to the kids that got captured. There was also not really too much of a point as to why Omnipotent City was a part of the story. I mean, I guess it was to show that the person Thor looked up to as a hero and figure inspiration, the Greek god Zeus, was still a coward and afraid to fight. But aside from that, we really didn't get much out of this portion of the movie, except maybe Russell Crowe as Zeus. He was honestly really great and funny while on the role. Our characters went to the city to recruit an army. They find out they're the only gods that actually care, and then they just leave. Like, what was the point of this second act? I guess they did walk away with Zeus's Thunderbolt, but that didn't really seem to offer too much help when the heroes fight with Gorr, since they literally just lose to him in the next encounter. I guess it was just so Thor could have a weapon after he lost Stormbreaker after Gorr took it from him. Another thing I found extremely weird. Why of all the things Gorr needed to carry out his plan was Stormbreaker? If he needed Stormbreaker to fulfill his plan that's probably gone on for centuries, why not just go to Nivalir and make Atri forge it for him? Did it just have to be Stormbreaker so Gorr would have a reason to fight Thor at all? It just felt very strangely convenient that Stormbreaker, something that is a relatively new thing to the MCU, would be a big plot point like this. There's also just a lot of stuff that seemed to be forced in the script that didn't feel like it really needed to be there. Like, I thought the whole thing with Eternity and the one wish for his finder was weird. I've already talked about Heimdall's son feeling really random, along with just the whole plotline with the kids being kind of the dumbest part of the film. And a lot of the emotional moments do feel strong, but there are just so few of them that it just seemed like I couldn't care or get invested in the world and characters that much, which to me is really what this film needed. I really wanted to not just like, but love this film. I really did, but I just can't seem to get over all the faults that I see with it. It seemed like the film genuinely had something awesome to offer, but I don't know if it was something like studio interference or something getting overlooked, but it just felt like there was something missing. Another one of the biggest lines of missed opportunity to me was when Gorr was essentially interrogating Thor and Jane. And I don't remember exactly what Gorr said, but he said in regards to Jane along the lines of, "You're dying, we share the same fate." Like, there it was. For the slightest moment, there was that magic that I was hoping was going to be throughout the whole film. The chance to make Jane's dynamic alongside Gorr so investing and interesting. But then it's basically completely forgotten afterward. You brought all these cool characters from the comics of the MCU, but you left behind all the elements that made those characters so unique and interesting in the first place. Jane's no longer this noble hero willing to die so the world could still have a Thor to look up to. She's just Thor's ex with his hammer. Gorr's no longer this interesting anti-messiah that you can understand his feeling of abandonment. Now he's just a sad man with a cursed blade. Everything leading up to this film just made it feel like it was going to be something truly epic. The cast, the inspiration, the passion of its crew, I genuinely thought with everything behind it that Thor Love and Thunder would be Marvel's next Infinity War, or at least be Marvel's next big gem. But to me, after seeing it for myself, I can't help but saying that it was just good or even okay and nothing more. I really hate saying this, but this film is officially the project that made me start to actually lose hope for Marvel, which is just a shame since I love the stuff the studio does. Well, mostly. I knew that Phase 4 of the MCU has a really split reputation when it came to people, and I really didn't mind them that much. But then I watched Love and Thunder. Personally, one of the most disappointing films I've seen in a long time. And yeah, I know how those people feel now. So what score would I give Thor Love and Thunder? An unfortunate 6.5 out of 10. And in all honesty, that feels like me being generous after going over everything I've talked about. The massive missed potential, the majorly bumpy road that was its plot, and overall making me think to myself while walking out that theater and on the drive home, what happened? But I guess I can't overlook that there was some good effort put into it in certain areas. The cast did a good enough job on the roles. I like the bright colors used in some scenes with the environment, really remind me of the vibrant vibes Ragnarok had, and this definitely is a Taiki Waiti film. It just carried his sort of energy and humor throughout the whole thing, which stated earlier can have its ups and downs. Also, I honestly really liked the creative choice of what they did for the Shadow Realm. Literally everything was covered in a black and white filter except for certain things like Gorr's eyes and all the weapons that our heroes had. It was genuinely really cool to see. It's just sad to say that all this good wasn't enough to outshine all the bad, at least for me. After writing this review, I'm honestly tempted to make another video or even a series of videos going over specifically what could have been done to fix this film. Heck, I'm willing to go out of my way to write my own dang take on a script for this movie. Just cause I'm that passionate about these characters, Jane and Gorr specifically, since I saw and continue to see so much potential with what this film could have done with them. So let me know if you'll all be interested in something like that. But until then, this is Rex Former, and this has been Thor Love and Thunder. Good fun, but greatly disappointing.